With over 2,300 hotels across the U.S. and Canada, Best Western is perfect for our annual spring hiking trip. It feels a little like... Okay, back to the hotel. What a great day. Life's a trip. Make the most of it at Best Western.
This episode is brought to you by Bai. It's Wonder Water. What makes Bai so great? It's simple. From Raspberry Lemon Lime by Sydney Sweeney to Zambia Bing Cherry and Palavo Pineapple Mango, Bai has antioxidants, electrolytes, and no artificial sweeteners. So for flavorful hydration, choose Bai. It's Wonder Water. Learn more about Bai and discover all of the exotic, bold flavors at drinkbai.com.
Welcome to the College Football Playoff Show Q&A, where Doug Lesmerises and Shahan Jeharaja answer questions about the playoff and its contenders from subscribers. All right, guys, thanks for joining us on the third week of this. Doug and Shahan. Shahan, your world exploded, right, man? Have you been sleeping at all?
The short answer is no. I had to be up at like 6 a.m. this morning for some interviews and such, and I am not a morning person. I'm very much a night person as a college football writer. So it's definitely been interesting. The first news, the Houston Chronicle original report broke while I was out getting some Chick-fil-A, and then the news officially came down yesterday right after I put some eggs in the skillet. So it's been a whole lot of bad timing for me.
From the chicken to the egg, the story of Big 12 realignment. You were out getting the Giannis order of Chick-fil-A, I think, right?
I was. Listen, man, I don't know if they decided to give Giannis his meal for free, whether they decided to pay him, but I know I was not the only one who was very intrigued by the idea of getting a half lemonade, half Sprite. So I got it. It's very good. I don't know if I'd get it again, but it was worth the experience.
But now you're going to have like a Pavlovian response. Whenever you drink half lemonade, half Sprite, you're going to get the realignment shakes of like, oh, who's leaving a conference today? All right. So this is the College Football Playoff Show press conference. We take your questions and then we ask them of each other, like we're in a news conference. So this is the first episode out this week because stuff is happening. And the main pod this week, we will certainly get to that. And that will include who has the best running backs among the title contenders. And should Iowa State join our playoff discussion? But for now, we're taking your questions, and all of them are Texas-Oklahoma realignment theme. But Shahan, when we asked the tech subscribers, it was like, hey, can you kind of make it playoff related? Because this podcast does not talk about TV contracts and that kind of thing, unless it relates to on-field football stuff. So if you want to talk about, grant of rights and that kind of thing, I don't know, go to a lawyer podcast. I'm not a lawyer. Shahan almost was, but we'll mostly talk football. Here we go. This is from our guy, Jorn. And by the way, all the questions are being asked of Shahan, because why would I pretend to know anything about this? This guy's been living it for a week. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the impact of the Oklahoma and Texas move for the 4 playoff regulars. And that's interesting for us, Shahan, because that's what this pod is based around. Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, and Oklahoma. Jordan says, I think it helps Clemson and Ohio State, hurts Bama a bit, and really hurts Oklahoma in the current format. In the 12-team format, I think it helps Clemson and Ohio State with first-round buys as well. So I like this question, Shahan, because it digs in on what this show is about. Let's talk about what's happening in terms of the 4 teams that have dominated the playoff. How are they affected?
Yeah, I think that certainly we are heading in a direction where those 4 regulars probably aren't going to be 4 regulars anymore. And Oklahoma has kind of consistently been that 4th team in. They haven't been a team that's won a national championship in that group. They aren't a team that's won a playoff game as yet. And them going to the SEC and having to compete directly with Alabama, I think they're absolutely right. I mean, Oklahoma, I don't think heading forward, whenever they join the SEC, will be considered one of these shoo-in teams, I think, heading forward. And certainly that doesn't mean that they won't make the playoff a lot. That doesn't mean that they might not be a better team. They might not, they might win a national championship after joining the SEC with some of the benefits of the SEC, but certainly their path to the playoff is going to get a lot harder. And so I would certainly think that outside of those SEC teams, the path to the playoff certainly opens up a whole lot more.
I do think that it gets harder for Oklahoma, that the idea of, hey, you were the king of your conference. Was it just that somebody had to win? I mean, somebody had to win the Big 12. Who's going to win the Big 12? If Texas is down, who else is going to win the Big 12? Now you're going to go show how really good you are. I think the effect is somewhat limited from a football standpoint on everybody else, on Ohio State, Clemson, and Alabama in that discussion. Yes, the SEC is going to be a monster, but I think that's more of an issue like for the other conferences as a whole. I don't know that it completely changes Clemson and Ohio State's chances of making the playoff or winning the playoff. The most direct effect is on recruiting. Ohio State, for instance, and other schools have been very successful in taking talent out of the state of Texas. So it might be harder for Ohio State to get Texas recruits like Jeff Okudah and J.K. Dobbins and Quinn Ewers and Caleb Burton and guys who have been Buckeyes and are going to be Buckeyes if Texas is now better. And if you think the SEC move helps Texas, maybe it hurts the Texas recruiting efforts of other teams. And that's not nothing. Like, I don't want to dismiss that, Shahan, because the game's about talent and talent's about recruiting. So take Quinn Ewers away from Ohio State, the number one quarterback recruit in the next class. If he's not coming to Ohio State, that changes Ohio State. And maybe 3 years from now, the next Quinn Ewers would be more likely to stay in Texas because Texas is in the SEC. That's real. I'm not sure anything else. Other than that, I think Bama's Bama, Clemson's Clemson, and Ohio State's Ohio State. Do you generally agree with that on the other three?
I agree with that. I think that the big thing that does change, though, is that all of a sudden, if you're saying there are 4 buys or even 4 playoff spots, certainly for the next couple of years, and 2 of those spots are going to only be one conference champion. If Oklahoma and Alabama can only be one conference champion and 1 bye, I think that does make it a whole lot easier for the Big Ten champion and even the Pac-12 champion to be able to get a bye heading forward.
Another question, and this one is in the same realm, from Jordan as well, just bringing it with this. Which teams outside of the regular 4, the ones we just talked about, does the addition of Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC help the most? And who does it hurt the most, Shahan?
Well, let's start with who it hurts first. I think that there's a very obvious answer to me, and that's Texas A&M. They have made their pitch since joining the SEC that we are the school that if you want to stay in the state of Texas and play in the Southeastern Conference, this is the place to do it. And I think Jimbo Fisher has turbocharged that to another level. Now, I'm not saying all of a sudden that Texas A&M is going to settle back to the pack and become Arkansas by any means, but their path, I think, becomes a whole lot harder. And on top of that, now with a potential SEC West, or whether it's pod scheduling or however they do it, they're going to have to play Texas and Oklahoma, 2 regional rivals, 2 schools that have historically been a whole lot better than Texas A&M, and 2 schools that Texas A&M in a lot of ways was trying to escape when they entered the SEC. And I think their path just becomes a whole lot harder. Their pitch and recruiting becomes a little bit less succinct, and I think that it's going to really come down to what they can do the next couple of years to separate themselves from the pack. And on the other side, the school that I think benefits the most from all of this is USC. If we start moving to a 4-team or 4-conference setup, the Pac-12 suddenly has a chance, right? Like we talk about these Power 5 conferences. The Pac-12 has not been a Power 5 conference in the context of the playoff for a long time. It has been conversations between Oklahoma, Ohio State, and a second SEC team before it's really been any conversation of Oregon, USC, whoever else, right? And there are exceptions, certainly. I think that they have 3 playoff appearances to their name, or maybe 2, but the Pac-12 suddenly has a much easier path, both in a 4-team setup that we have right now, and also in a 12-team setup where you, again, are potentially looking at a bye. So I think that USC's path just became a whole lot easier.
I don't know what the answer to who it hurts the most could be other than Texas A&M, right? I mean, it's such an obvious thing. I think that has to be the answer. When I thought about who it helped, I thought of LSU. And the reason I thought that is LSU has been living in this division with Alabama, and it feels like, Shahan, certainly what's going to happen, either Alabama and Auburn are going to move to the East in the SEC, or they're going to go to some kind of pod thing. But I think it's going to be a world where LSU is going to wind up competing more with Texas and Oklahoma and maybe A&M as opposed to Alabama. And to move the biggest blockade in college sports out of your division, I think it's possible, Shahan, that LSU is Oklahoma. And that if LSU had been in the Big 12 for the past 7 years, LSU would have made the playoff 4 times. And Oklahoma would have been in the same division as Bama, being like, man, we're good, but we can't get past these guys. So there's some maneuvering in there that I think for the SEC teams, that everybody that's not Bama, it becomes, as you're enhancing the reputation of the SEC. So I think you increase the chances of a second SEC team in the playoff. I think you enhance the reputation of even more SEC teams in a 12-team playoff than you would have gotten before. And it lessens the impact of Bama on you and gives you a little more room to spread rings. And listen, Texas and Oklahoma are good, but if you're LSU, who'd you rather play? I'd rather deal with Texas and Oklahoma than deal with Bama every single year. So I think they have a chance they may remind us that they were closer to that top tier all along than we realize, and they just happen to be in the same division as the King. So I do think you can look at a lot of different people who might win in different ways out of this.
Yeah, no question. And I think that the same side of that for people that it might hurt, if Alabama does move to the East, right? All of a sudden, Georgia's path becomes harder. All of a sudden, Florida's path becomes harder. A lot's going to have to come out of whatever they do from a scheduling perspective with this league before we can really answer this question fully.
We'll take a little break from the questions. And again, if you guys want to be able to ask questions on this podcast, it's $1 a month to be able to do that. We send out a survey where you guys get to vote on whether a team should be in our playoff discussion. Once the season starts, we'll be kicking a team out. You like to vote. Your voice should be heard. It's an easy way to vote. You send a text to 817-442-6789. Our numbers are creeping up as people kind of get an idea of what this is. That gives you the right to send us texts. We'll answer those directly every now and then when we can. We'll use your questions on this podcast. We'll ask you to be part of our decision-making process with the surveys, and then we'll send you little tidbits, especially once camps get started, especially once we get into the actual season. We'll be dropping little things about National College Football. If you're a fan of a team, but you want a little taste of what else is going around the world, around the country, without having to go search for it, this will help you. And if you'd like to have people, listen to your opinion, this will help you too, because you get to vote. So again, if you haven't done it, if you're listening to this and haven't done it, you get to try it for 2 weeks for free. That's $1, literally $1 a month. 817-442-6789. Let's go to Matthew from Concord Township, Ohio. This is a question about Oklahoma. Oklahoma has made the 4-team playoff and kind of immediately proven they were a little fraudulent. That suggests they wouldn't be going 12-1 in the SEC, playing A&M, Bama, LSU, and other teams. So then the question becomes, do they lose only 2 games once they go to the SEC and still make the playoff, or do they lose 3 or more and start missing out? I think there should be years where they do go 11-2 and still they're pretty good, but not every year. This is Matt getting a little specific about the general question, Shahan, of how good Oklahoma's going to be in the SEC.
There will, to me, be a learning curve. I don't think that they're going to jump right in, kind of like Texas A&M did in 2012, and dominate the league and go 11-2 and all that sort of stuff, right? Like they said, I mean, you were talking about a team that kind of was able to go through the regular season without having to play a top-level opponent. I mean, it's been a while since the Big 12 and Oklahoma have both kind of been at the top at the same time, right? And so I think that when they head to the SEC, there's going to be a couple of years of, man, this is tough, right? This is going to Texas A&M, going to Texas, going to Alabama, going to Georgia, going to LSU, having to do that year after year after year. They're going to be better than a lot of those teams, but having to play them all back to back to back to back to back, I think is going to be really tough. Now, the flip side that I'll say of that is that it is a credit to what Oklahoma does from a coaching and talent development perspective that they've been able to cement themselves as one of these top 4 teams. You look at them being quote unquote fraudulent. A big part of that is because there are a couple of teams that recruit at that elite super whatever level, and Oklahoma is not one of them. And they've managed to be nationally competitive despite that. Well, now heading to the SEC, I think that they're going to have a great chance to enter that top conversation of competing for top 5 classes instead of top 8 to 9 classes of where you're getting these key guys on the offensive and defensive line. Especially defensive line has been an issue where, they've gotten top 150 guys, but they need to start getting top 50 guys. They have to start getting 5 stars at those positions. And I think that move to the SEC and continuing to be nationally relevant is the way that they're going to be able to move forward from that perspective.
They're killing it at quarterback, right? I mean, they have a freshman in Caleb Williams, who is the number 1 quarterback in his class. They just got a commitment from Malachi Nelson out of LA, the number 1 quarterback in 2023. That's not SEC related. So I am intrigued to see sort of this. We know what Oklahoma's style is, right? We know Lincoln Riley is a quarterback guru. We know what they're like offensively. We know they have been, when it comes to being a top tier team, somewhat defensively challenged on the biggest stage at times. So if you can get a few more defensive recruits, and that is if you want to go get some dudes on defense, right? If you want to go get some size, some great athletes with quick feet who can run and hit and understand the game, I mean, you want to go to SEC country. I remember that with Ohio State, just like 10 years ago, Ohio State desperate for athletic defensive tackles that were all over the SEC. It's those kinds of players, athletic linebackers, right? I mean, like, we know corners with great hips who can run, who can cover, in zone and man. We know what that looks like. If Oklahoma adds a couple more guys like that a year, Shahan, to what they already do offensively, they might be a monster. They might be a monster. But I think the bottom line is they're going to have to be better. They can't be who they are and compete at the same level.
Right.
They have to be better, but then this might allow them to take that step.
Right. And I think that the other thing that's going to be a little bit of a blessing for them is we don't know the timeline of when all this is going to happen. We don't know when Oklahoma is going to be playing in the SEC. But having a little bit of a runway before you launch into the SEC is not a bad thing. The opportunity to say, we're in the Big 12 right now, but we have 2 years, let's say, to recruit at that SEC level, build up to that point. That's a big part of how Texas A&M was able to jump in right away with a great offensive line, with a great defensive line, with a great quarterback in Johnny Manziel. These were guys who were recruited when Texas A&M knew that they were going to make the jump, but before they actually did it. So that's one thing where maybe, okay, by the time it's 2023 and they head over or whatever, that they maybe have built up a little bit to that point.
We're going to come back after a quick break. A guy named Doug is going to throw in a couple questions for our expert Shahan before we get back to our great tech subscriber questions. We'll do that next on the College Football Playoff Show. Doug Maurice, Shahan Jeharaja. Again, if you want to be a tech subscriber and ask questions, we certainly invite you for that. And if you're just listening, thanks, right? We're trying this. It's nuts. It's nuts, man. It's like, let's launch in July in this little dead window. It's like, the dead window that blew up college sports. We'll get into blowing stuff up at the end of the questions. We've got a blow stuff up type of question. But I do want to ask you, Shahan, when do you think this will happen? Because that is I don't know if it's complicating. It's an intriguing part of this that, maybe everybody just says, you know what, it's over. And they're in the SEC next year, or maybe they run through the next couple of years until their grant of rights expires. When do you expect to see Oklahoma and Texas playing in the SEC?
I'll try not to go on too much of a monologue here. So the first thing that we're going to have to wait and see is that those other 8 schools are looking for new homes, whether it's adding new schools, whether it's just checking kind of what their value is going to be on the open market, certainly looking to the Pac-12, the ACC, the Big Ten, and certainly the SEC as well, though I wouldn't be super optimistic about that for any of the other 8 schools. And so that's going to be a big part of it, is if a number of these schools find new destinations, the Big 12 could just dissolve and everybody gets out of having to pay their way out of the Big 12. Now, I do think that Oklahoma and Texas did not plan for this news to become this public this quickly. I think in a lot of ways, they planned to, okay, we'll go through 2024, and then after that, we'll make the move. Maybe we'll make an announcement more like next summer. But the news broke, and the cat's out of the bag at this point. So I do think that certainly they'll go through the 2021 season as members of the Big 12. I could see them going through 2022 as members of the Big 12 as well. But I would say that they have to pay what they would have received from the Big 12 as a fine if they were to leave the conference. That's, if you're buying out 2 years of this contract, you're paying $80 million. And even for schools like Texas and Oklahoma, that's a lot of money. So the question is, okay, how much are they willing to wait? How much are they willing to spend? We've seen reporting that says that they are more than willing to wait out the duration of the contract. I'm obviously very skeptical about that. I would say that 2023 is probably where I'd assume that we have an answer on that. I think that Texas and Oklahoma will try their best to raise that $80 million from private donors and such, because I think that having to drag their way through the Big 12 for 4 years when everybody knows that they're leaving. We could have an announcement as soon as Friday about whether they're joining the SEC. Having this drag on for 4 years is bad for everybody involved. And so I do think that it'll be a little shorter than that. Next year's tight. I think that that's a short window. I mean, we are well into the 2021-2022 school year. You're going to have to make a decision before then. That's probably a little tight, but I think that probably by 2023, we're potentially looking at Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC.
Last question from Doug in Ohio.
Did his dollar clear? I don't know. We need to check on that.
Let me, I don't know if he might not have a dollar. I think he had to put it on his credit card, which got declined. It's a dollar. Really, you really should. I mean, come on. Can you throw us a buck? Anybody out there hearing this? Can you throw us a buck? 817-442-6789. What's it like in Texas? Like, are people freaking out? Are fans, you work, again, people should be reading you. You've been writing a lot of stuff about this. Make sure you're following Shahan on Twitter. Write for Dave Campbell, Texas Football. Like, are University of Texas fans, are they super excited? Are they confused? Are they worried? And then people in Texas who maybe aren't Texas fans, but are fans of other schools in the Big 12 or just other schools in general, like, what do they think? What's the mood among football fans in that state?
I don't think it's a coincidence that Texas made this move right now, coming off of the worst decade of football, maybe in the history of the program, right? They haven't had anything to sell their fans on or off the field for a very long time. And this is a program that is as proud as any program in America, even though in the last however long, it's been a while since they've had a lot to sell on the field. And so Texas fans are very excited about this. They want to be part of that big party. They want to feel like they matter. They love the opportunity to remind everybody that it doesn't matter. We're Texas. They're going to take us regardless. We can kind of throw our weight around. Now, the thing that'll be kind of interesting is when they actually do enter the SEC, whether they're able to kind of throw their weight around to the same extent. But right now, there's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of optimism that, hey, we're going to go from being a top 7 recruiting power to a top 1 recruiting power, right? That's really the goal, I think, in a lot of ways. Now, for people who are not Texas fans in this state, there's a lot of anger from everybody. It really, no matter what other fan base they're part of. And the biggest reason for that, with the Big 12 schools, 3 Big 12 schools, Texas Tech, Baylor, TCU, certainly this is going to devalue their inventory a whole lot. Their payouts could potentially, if they were to drop to the AAC, I mean, you're talking about $37 million payout last year in the Big 12 versus 7 in the AAC. And I certainly think that adding those schools would help. It would help raise the inventory of the AAC, where maybe you're more like a $15 to $20 million league, but that's a lot lower. I don't think I need to tell anybody that. And so, and then for everybody else too, I mean, for Texas A&M, their fans are annoyed. This was their identity, was that they get to be the SEC school. They get to be the nationally competitive school. They get to host Alabama. If you want to play against Alabama, you got to play at Texas A&M. This is going to hurt that. And so in a lot of ways, this move for Texas is a huge dent in the rest of the state's football, both high school and college, I think, in a lot of ways. Certainly Texas has to do what's best for it, and it makes a lot of sense for why they'd want to do it. But certainly it's not leaving a good taste in everybody else's mouth.
Last thing on this from me is, should the SEC have any fears about Texas? Because Texas, to me, feels like the person you invite to the party because, like, they're fun and they're kind of interesting, and you heard that they were at another party and they were kind of cool and they made it fun and they're rich, right? And then they come in your house and they like pull out their 6-shooters and start blowing holes in the ceiling and shooting your chandelier, and you're like, what is up with this guy? And it's like, you invited him to your party. If you're Alabama and you're already Alabama, and Georgia, you're kind of Georgia, and LSU, you're LSU. I get inviting Texas, I guess, but should you be worried they're going to shoot your chandelier? Because I think if you asked everybody, I mean, ask Nebraska, who left the Big 12 a decade ago kind of because of this, there are other houses that they've destroyed, including their own house at times. They've burned their own house to the ground in the middle of a party. I'm not saying they're terrible people. They just are occasionally maybe a little out of control. Will the SEC be able to contain them, or do they maybe have to get some extra insurance here?
Well, because this is obviously a visual medium, I saw a meme the other day that was like the Grim Reaper meme going door to door, and there's the Southwest Conference, there's the Big 12, and now it's knocking on the SEC's door, right? Because Texas is coming to town. Here's the thing that the SEC has that none of those other conferences had is, yeah, Texas is a big deal. There are 4 or 5 other programs that I'm not saying they're on Texas's level, but they are real close. I mean, you start getting to the Auburns of the world, the LSUs of the world. These aren't even the flagship programs of the SEC in a lot of ways, and they are on a level financially and profile-wise where you are competing with Texas, right? I think the thing that's going to be real interesting for Texas is that the SEC doesn't need them. The SEC would like them, but the SEC doesn't need them, right? If they did nothing at all, if they didn't add Texas or Oklahoma, they are still likely the best conference in America by orders of magnitude, right? And so now you add Texas, you add Oklahoma, and here's the deal: if Texas makes a fuss, if they make a stink, guess what? You can throw them out, right? Who cares? For the SEC, it doesn't really matter, especially if you add Oklahoma. Again, even with just Oklahoma, nobody's competing with you from a conference perspective. I had somebody compare this to an arms race. The arms race is over. The Cold War was won, right? So the SEC won. And so I don't think that the SEC needs to have the same concerns as maybe some other conferences like the Big 12, like the Southwest Conference back in the day, because I think that this is the first time, maybe ever, that Texas is entering a conference that truly it needs more than they need them.
I do wonder when Nick Saban retires in 30 years, he'll coach till he's 100. That power vacuum, because there's a difference between success and power. They are related. They are not the same thing. Texas is very powerful, not very successful on the football field. Alabama is currently very powerful and very successful, but I think a lot of that power is derived from its success, right? I don't know that Alabama has to be the dominant force in the SEC. I don't know that that is inherently true, right? And so if Saban retires and Alabama takes a step back into the pack and it's like, oh, I wonder who the dominant force in the SEC is going to be. And like Texas is going to kick the saloon doors open and be like, we're here, baby. And then all of a sudden it's going to be like, oh man, I thought we had those guys under control. And now there's like a power vacuum because the greatest college football coach in history is no longer coaching in the conference. I wonder what that would look like, right? Because I think that's in terms of making conference decisions and that kind of thing. You still got to prove it on the field. Maybe they step into the vacuum on the field, but they might try to step into the vacuum off the field too, because I think a lot of Alabama's power is tied to Nick Saban, where Texas is just, it's more ingrained, as we see, because they haven't won anything in a decade and everybody's fighting over trying to get them.
Yeah, I do think that's certainly a factor to take into account. Now, again, like you mentioned, neither of us are going to be alive to see it because Nick Saban's going to retire in 100 years. But I think that certainly when you get to the SEC, one thing that you've seen, the reason that Alabama dominates the SEC behind the scenes like it does is not because of the money it brings in. They're like 9th or 10th, right, in revenue, and there are multiple schools that are well ahead of them in terms of school revenue. But once you get to that level where you're talking amongst peers, like the brand doesn't really matter as much. It really does come down to success. It does come down to power. It comes down to who will listen to you too. And certainly, like you said, if Alabama loses Nick Saban and they're kind of in that post Nick Saban world, yeah, Texas I think is going to try to kick in the doors and try to make a scene. I still think that there are enough programs with real power and also real success to potentially still shut them down.
You can be honest with me here. I'm talking about like shooting your gun into a ceiling and kicking open a saloon door. Am I being Texas? Is that I'm sitting here in Ohio just talking about, oh, Texas, they live in a saloon. It's like, it's not, it's America in 2021, Doug.
Man, the worst thing that's ever happened to our state is the fact that somehow they've decided that their mascot is Matthew McConaughey, some dude who like lives in East Texas. And I just, Austin's like this super modern, like growing city, like tech center. And they're like, well, look, it's Matthew McConaughey. Like, okay, cool. I don't know. I see Teslas out there. What are we talking about?
Yeah. I'm sorry if I don't mean to be that way, but it's when you're not in Texas, sometimes you fall into it.
It's listen, I don't love it, but it's our own damn fault.
Again, that's I like that as a slogan for the podcast as well. College football playoff show. Hey, it's our own damn fault. All right, a couple actual questions about Texas. I'm going to combine these. One is from Kane McGirt. Shahan and Doug, I don't understand Texas's interest in joining the SEC. Do they see this as an opportunity to extend their footprint in recruiting and TV money? If it were to happen today, I think Texas would be no higher than a second-tier team in the SEC. I don't see the competitive advantage in that. So that's from Kane, and it's kind of like, are they really going to be a second-tier team? Then again, Jorn, lighten it up. How quickly is Texas going to be able to rebuild that program into an SEC contender? They can't even win the Big 12. So let's combine that. Do you think they will be second tier when they move in? And what does it look like when they become, or already are they, what does it look like when Texas is a first tier SEC team?
One thing that I did when this all happened was I went back and looked at the last couple of years of Texas A&M. And Texas A&M was very much a middling Big 12 team. I mean, I think that they finished at over 500 one time in their last 5 years in the conference. And so if you're Texas, and the word they love to throw around is little brother, and you see little brother go to the SEC and surpass you in basically every way on the football field, where they're recruiting just as well, if not better, they're competing just as well, if not better, they're sending more guys to the NFL. In so many ways, this is an ego trip for Texas. Looking at Texas A&M and saying, why is that happening? Why are we falling behind? There's literally no input reason that they should be ahead of us right now. And in a lot of ways, I think that this move to the SEC and the appeal of it is to try to close that inefficiency. Now, at the same time, I don't think that means that all of a sudden they're going to be able to do what Texas A&M has done. I don't think they're as well organized. I don't think they're as well coached. I don't think that they have as much of an implicit identity. And, so will it work? I don't know. But I think that that's the draw for Texas is, sure, yeah, more money, whatever. You're already the richest athletic program in America. Cool. But I think that the biggest thing that they say is, okay, we can not lose recruiting battles because of conference if we enter the SEC. We can add some of these advantages that Texas A&M has leveraged into being last year a top 5 program in America. And again, will it work? I don't know. I don't think that Texas is going to be competing for an SEC championship for many years, to be quite honest. I mean, there's too many good teams. There's too many good coaches. There are too many kind of teams with infrastructure that's built up over the last 10 years that Texas has to catch up to now. Now, I get it. I get the opportunity to play on the biggest stage and recruit at the highest level, but I certainly do think that those questions about competitiveness are very well founded, because we haven't really seen that, like you mentioned, even with Texas reeling in top 5 recruiting classes in the Big 12.
So much of team success, even at the highest level, is tied into your head coach. Do you have a guy who can do it? Texas A&M went and got a guy who could do it in Jimbo Fisher. They got a national championship winning head coach. But I don't know that Texas A&M would have been able to get Jimbo Fisher if they weren't in the SEC. I'm not sure Jimbo Fisher leaves Florida State for Big 12 Texas A&M, right? And so it's like, well, what got it there? Did going to the SEC make Texas A&M better? Well, not in and of itself, but then it allowed them to do things that made them better. I'm not saying Steve Sarkisian won't work. We don't know. But I think if they're in the SEC, Shahan, the next time Texas has to make a coaching hire, maybe they won't be on this, hey, we'll get the Houston coach, or we'll get the guy who left USC. And maybe they'll just get like Dabo Swinney. You know what I mean? Like, I do think, is that the kind of thing that it's obvious. It's not being in the SEC. It's what being in the SEC allows you to do that makes you win. And that's where I think you see it with Texas A&M.
Yeah, well, I think that the question does come down to, right, we saw the Urban Meyer thing happen this year, right? They went hard after him, and Steve Sarkisian, in a lot of ways, I think he's a good hire, but he's their backup plan, right? And so it's easy to say, yeah, well, why don't you just grab Dabo? Why don't you just grab Saban? Why don't you just grab Urban? That's kind of been the MO in a lot of ways, and it's left them in a spot where people are turning them down very publicly and very embarrassingly in a lot of ways. So yeah, I mean, sure, maybe going to the SEC is the thing that kind of changes some of that, but they're going to be competing with other SEC teams for these coaches too, and other programs that, again, are better organized, better funded, better all this sort of stuff, better alignment from athletic department, from president down to football team and everyone else. And I think that's been one of their biggest issues, because listen, if they don't hire Charlie Strong and Tom Herman back to back, like, we might not be having this conversation, right? If there's a clean sort of springboard into more success after Mac Brown. But here we are. And if they've struggled this much to hire coaches when you have this much of an advantage over the rest of the field, there's no implicit reason that it's suddenly going to change when you're playing against tougher teams.
Yeah, this is not a move really of strength by Texas, right? That I think Texas and Ohio State, I think they're easy teams to compare a lot, that they're the largest athletic programs, the richest athletic programs in their good, but not number one conferences. And like Ohio State's fine. Ohio State doesn't need the SEC because they've made the right hires and had success on the field. And if Texas was having that kind of success, I'd be like, well, why would we rock the boat, right? Like, we're good. We're the king of our castle. We don't need to leave. And so I think there's a lot there to that.
Yeah. And for me, the comparison that I often make is I think that Oklahoma and Ohio State have a lot in common because they have been well-run athletic departments top to bottom. They don't miss. Even when their hires don't work, it's not because of all the extracurriculars, right? And to me, Texas is so much like Alabama because Alabama, back in the day, before they happened to hire the greatest coach in the history of football, was a freaking mess, right? It was a political warfare. It was, all this sort of stuff not working out, not to mention the whole Mike Price situation, right? Like, this is what Alabama was in a lot of ways before they cemented themselves under Nick Saban. And that's obviously the hope if you're Texas, is that you just got to hit the hire once and then everything comes together. Now, that's easier said than done, but I think that is the hope in a lot of ways, that Texas feels like, okay, eventually we'll luck into the right coach, and who knows if they will.
Let's dig in a little more specifically on playoff questions as this move gets ready to happen. It's from our guy, RJ. In the world of a 4-team playoff, Texas and Oklahoma joining the SEC, I assume it all but assures that the SEC gets 2 teams into the playoff each year. That leaves 2 spots for Notre Dame, Clemson, the Big Ten champ, and everyone else to kind of figure out. It's not that different from how things are now, but it makes it much more overt and eliminates all margin for error for non-SEC teams. It seems like it would absolutely force a 12-team playoff before they could join the SEC to keep some level of competitive balance. So we have an expansion question that we're going to get to next, Shahan. So let's save that. Let's talk about, as long as we have a 4-team playoff, and it might not happen at all. Because if you ask me, it's like how this is going to pair up. I mean, it seems like it's very possible. Maybe Texas and Oklahoma hang on for one more year. They're still in 22, and in 23, they go, the playoff expands to 12, and we're rolling, and that is no coincidence. That's a Sankey incidence. That is diabolical, behind the scenes, working everybody over. But let's imagine, and maybe it's not imaginary, what's it going to mean if Texas and Oklahoma are in the SEC and we're still in a 4-team playoff world? How do you think that shakes out?
Yeah, well, certainly to start things off, I think that Oklahoma and Texas don't make this move if there's not a path for them to make the playoff in a 12-team world. Because, listen, you can't say year over year that you're going to beat Alabama. You just can't. Yes, I definitely think that that 2 SEC teams are almost certain every single year because you have Texas, you have Oklahoma, you have Georgia as well. And just among that group, I mean, Texas A&M I didn't even mention, LSU I didn't even mention. Like, these are nationally competitive teams. And yeah, I think it does sort of settle into a new normal where you have the 2 SEC champions and Ohio State and Clemson, and nobody else is really competing with that group. And so yeah, I mean, I do think that is how it will settle out. I mean, the Big 12, I don't think would have a contender. I don't think the Pac-12 would have a real contender. And year over year, I think that's probably what you would see.
I think it will be a very interesting read from the playoff committee, because not to, talk about all the ifs and could be's, but let's say the Big 12 continues to exist. It's still a 4-team playoff world. The Big 12 adds 2 teams. It continues to exist. And somebody's got to win it. And they're still viewed as, I don't know, is it Power 5? Is it whatever? They absorb the American. It's something, even if they're the 5th conference. But if you get into a world where, I mean, they've said championships matter, and there have been times when that hasn't been the case, right? I mean, Ohio State as the non-Big Ten champ got in ahead of the Big Ten champ. Alabama as a non-champ got in ahead of champs one year. And we've seen it happen. Not a ton. Let's say there's an undefeated TCU team in the whatever is the Big 12, and they're a 13-0 champ. And like the SEC just like beats each other up, and there's like a champ, like say there's an undefeated SEC champ, but like everybody else has 2 losses because Oklahoma lost to Bama in a crossover, and then also, lost 1 division game, but they still like, you know what I mean? Like I don't know how the committee would look at, okay, here's an undefeated Big 12 champ and here's a 2-loss SEC team. Now, if it's a 1-loss SEC team and you had like 2 undefeated SEC teams in the championship game and you take the winner and the loser, that probably would happen. But they'd have to decide what they value, Shahan. Now, the thing that might be easier for the committee is like, well, I mean, when Oklahoma was in that conference, they were beating everybody. And so now there's an undefeated champ of their old conference, and they might have 2 losses, but we kind of have proof that they're better than those guys. I think it would help the decision-making. I'm not sure what they would do.
Yeah.
I think there might be people on that committee who would almost push back of like, oh, you think you're the SEC now? Well, you're not going to push us around. We're still going to value championships. I could see 3 or 4 people in that 13-person room thinking that way.
Sure. Well, I think that this comes back to, if you're talking a 13-0 undefeated TCU Big 12 champion, and really I think it's similar for the Pac-12, right? You're talking like 13-0 USC or something like that. That's what it'll take to even start a conversation. And even that is no guarantee, right? Like, you are more in a position where the Pac-12 and this new look of Big 12 would be considered a lot more like a Cincinnati or a Houston back in the day, right? That's would more be the comparison. And again, if Ohio State is 12-1 and TCU's 13-0, this isn't a conversation. Ohio State's going to get in over them. Same with Clemson. And again, so we're all of a sudden at a point where we're talking, well, what would 10-2 Georgia versus 13-0 TCU be? The fact that we're having this conversation, I think, is the answer.
Let's do a little expansion thing here, because I think this is really based on reality. It's our guy Mason. Will playoff expansion still happen, or are some people deterred due to the news of Texas and Oklahoma? This wouldn't be happening unless they knew the 12 team was coming, because Oklahoma and Texas, right, are not going if they think they have to win the SEC to get in. It's like, oh, I wonder, to me, right, Shahan, it's like, oh, I wonder why the 12-team discussion is happening now. And it's because Greg Sankey, the SEC commissioner, was working on this behind the scenes and simultaneously kickstarting a 12-team playoff conversation. And these are parallel paths. Is that's not reporting. That's just like looking at how stuff is working out, right? That has to be the case.
Absolutely. This does not happen without a clear path for Oklahoma to make the playoff basically every single year, right? That's their thought process is, look, we are the 4th team, but we don't have a real shot at a national championship. Well, we're not saying that we're going to beat Alabama and Georgia and LSU and Texas A&M every single year, but we want to feel like at least when we do, we still have a path to being in the playoff every single year. And yeah, I mean, if you are an SEC team and you add Texas and Oklahoma, and like you said, even for Alabama, if it's a 4-team playoff, this becomes a really difficult path. Maybe you're not interested in that with the 4-team path. So no, this is always going to happen. And the other thing too is that there's still, for everybody else, no downside, right? If you were locking in 6 conference champions making the playoff, whatever the Big 12 turns into is going to be still excited about that, even if they certainly don't have a chance to win. The AAC is still going to be very excited about that. The Pac-12 is still going to be very excited about that. So there is still, even with all this news, there are no stakeholders who have any incentive to not want to still expand.
Yeah, it's happening. And I assume it's happening in 23, because everybody wants it. So what are you waiting for? Everyone's going to make more money. Everybody's going to have more opportunity, and it fits with where college football is going. All right. Last break, couple explosion questions on the horizon. And then in our get to know each other segment, I'm going to ask Shahan the craziest thing that has ever happened to him or that he has done at a sporting event. And as you will find out, the questions that I'm going to continue to ask in this segment of our podcast is just a chance for me to tell old man stories. So I got my answer to that, but we have 2 explosion questions next on the College Football Playoff Show. Doug and Shahan going a little long on the press conference show this week because, stuff's burning. 817-442-6789 if you'd like to ask questions. All right. I like imaginary, like, hey, everybody make your own 16-team conference, like when it's totally imaginary, and when it's a little bit imaginary, but it actually could happen and you're trying to guess what's going to happen. Now it feels like homework to me. And I don't think sports should feel like homework. That's not what I'm here for. I have nightmares about homework still. I'm not here to do it for fun, but I get that other people enjoy it. So I do think a little dash of it is okay. So let's go to our guy, Kevin, from the 864 in South Carolina. Would love to hear your thoughts on this scenario. What if college football went to a Champions League format? I don't even know what the Champions League is. That's soccer in Europe. I don't mean to be dismissive. Again, soccer wasn't a thing when I was a kid. My cousin liked soccer. I was like, isn't that on another continent? You take the top 40 programs, they're placed in an elite conference. There's random scheduling. The top 12 make the playoffs. The teams that did not break 500 would drop out and then be replaced by top teams outside the top 40. Thanks. That's from Kevin. So I think more generally, Shahan, the idea of could we get to a place where it's not really conferences. And I've been confused by a little bit of this. Every part of every conversation is football, 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 football. When you join a conference, it's not just your football team that joins the conference. Your soccer team, your swimming team, your field hockey team, your baseball team. All these teams now have longer flights. It's harder for your fans to see them. It's more expensive. I wonder why we don't just break football off. Let football do what it's going to do. Everybody else can stay in their conferences for everything else, and then football's out on its own. But generally the idea, whether it's Kevin's idea, Shahan, or something where it's tiers, not conferences, and maybe it's football only. What do you think of that?
It's interesting for sure. I think that if we were to do something like that, 40 teams probably doesn't make sense. You probably are looking at more of like a super league type thing where you're taking 16 or something like that and playing a league. Listen, I don't hate it. I get the idea of it. Now, the one thing that I'll say that's interesting about college athletics is that these guys only have 4 years of eligibility, right? So to kind of not know where you're going to be or kind of enter a program thinking one thing and not really, I mean, that sort of thing is kind of tough. I don't know how much I love that side of things, but at the same time, we are reaching a world of certainly the teams that have the haves, they get the opportunities. I do personally love the idea of relegation. That's probably a reason that won't happen, is because that's so much money that you'd be trading off between. But certainly I think it would be a lot of fun. I think that, and to get back to your point, we are probably heading in a direction of autonomous football, of probably more like 64 teams breaking off from the rest of the NCAA and kind of doing their own thing in that world, and then having more ties to the NCAA with your other sports. But it would be fun, a lot of logistics figure out, and certainly I would want to make sure that the players and kids are kind of at the center of it.
I could imagine some kind of thing where there's almost like two conferences, like there is, or like in every pro sport. As there's the American League and the National League, there's the Eastern Western, like we understand that. There's the AFC and the NFC. And if there's like an SEC and like a non-SEC, right? And if you had 20 teams in each of those, and there were 4 5-team divisions in each of them, and you played every year, you played the 4 teams in your division, and then you played, 8 other games in your conference, and then the 4 division winners then played off to create a conference champ, and then the 2 conference champs played each other in, like, I don't know, the Super Bowl. I mean, it's the format that exists for every pro sport, and maybe there is a regional thing, like in the NBA, it's East and West, which frankly, I think I've been thinking a lot about that. Why is baseball's not like that? The football's not like that. Why does that have to be regional?
It's a relic.
So like that idea where it's like, hey, you have these 20 that kind of their thing. You have these 20 that are kind of their thing, but you have like that feels on the horizon to me, a version of that. Maybe it's 2 conferences of 24 and it's the top 48. And then I still think you could have the Big Ten. It's like Ohio State could be in the Big Ten. Alabama and Texas could be in the SEC. Clemson could be in the ACC. And then for football, it's like they go off and do their thing. The teams that are in your conference that aren't on that level, it's like every year, it's like we're going to send our 6 best out into the world. Go guys. But let's not pretend that Vanderbilt is going to do that. They're not going to be in the thing where the top 48, but they're still an SEC member and they play for their own thing. Like, I just think we're creeping towards that. I think we're creeping towards whatever exact version of it that is. But I think that makes much more sense than, hey, let's have the SEC expand to include Arizona, and let's have the Big Ten expand to include Washington. It's like, what are you talking about?
Right.
Like, that doesn't make sense. Let's just do football teams, whatever, because there's no reason for Florida and Arizona to be playing each other in soccer, and there's no reason for Ohio State and Washington State to be playing each other in field hockey. Like that, none of that makes sense. Let's just do it with football.
Yeah, and I think that one thing that we've seen, even at the lower levels, FCS Division II, Division III, is we have seen that move towards sort of pod scheduling. You know, one conference that I cover is the WAC, right? The WAC is back in a different form in the FCS level, and they sort of have, like you talk about, I mean, they have their football teams that are mostly Texas-based, and then they have pods in sort of an East-West division for all of the other sports because nobody wants to travel that much, right? And so maybe that's where we're headed. Now, listen, is it my favorite idea to kind of try to make college football into the NFL? I don't know. I mean, that's certainly, I think, a conversation for another day. But like you said, it does feel at least somewhat inevitable.
Last one. This is the explosion or implosion. It probably is more of an implosion because it's sort of like they did it to themselves, right? And it's falling in on itself. This is from our guy, Billy. Is college football about to implode or become 1,000 times better? He wanted us to do an emergency pod. We didn't do an emergency pod. We saved it for this. This craziness has made for the best July of college football ever. Even if nothing changes, this is so much more interesting than guessing depth charts and breaking down 30-point favorites in non-conference games in September. I actually disagree with that a little bit because my favorite part about football is the football. And you can find yourself, which is like the whole point of this podcast. We are talking about who's going to win football games, but you can spend your whole life talking about NIL, COVID regulations, transfer portal, conference realignment, playoff expansion. And then it's like, what's the other thing? What was the other thing I wanted to talk about? Oh, that's right. Who's good at football? So there is a part of me that it's like, I get it. And it is a 365-day sport. We don't have to do depth charts. We don't be needing to do depth charts. See, this is what college football has done to me. Maybe this is more interesting in July. But I'll tell you what, like once we get to August, I want to do depth charts. That's why we're talking about whether Iowa State should be in the playoff. Like we're ready. Shahan, we planned. We're ready to do football in July, and the sport won't let us. Implode or better? If you had to pick one, college football imploding or getting better?
I feel like for me personally, and what I like about football, it's a little bit more of an implosion direction. Look, historically, one of the great things about, it's the worst things, but also the great things about college football is that national championships were kind of just a thing that happened, right? We had the AP poll, we had just these completely garbage ways of determining champions, right? And so like historically, the focus has been on, it doesn't really matter necessarily how good your team is. Certainly want your team to beat your rivals. But you know, to me, the biggest part about football that I enjoy is getting to walk into the office and be like, hey man, my team beat your team, right? That's what it comes down to. I want my team to play teams around me, right? So I can go talk to other graduates in my office. And that part of things is something that's disappointing. Now, the one thing that I'll say, certainly everybody's writing the woe is me columns right now about this, but at least Texas is entering the SEC and getting to play Oklahoma still, getting to play Arkansas again, getting to play Texas A&M again. I do like that part. I hope that we're able to maintain some more of those rivalries heading forward because that's a big part of the game to me. That's cool. Yeah, Alabama played Ohio State last year for the national title. That's really cool, but okay, that's one part of the game. I want Alabama, Auburn to matter. I want Alabama, LSU to matter. I want Ohio State, Michigan to matter, which obviously Michigan has a lot of work to do for that to happen. And so from that perspective, that's the one thing that I really just don't want to lose is I don't want to devalue everybody else for the sake of focusing in on these tiny little things.
You're young in real life and I'm old in real life. You have the old man opinion. I have the young man opinion because you're like, I'm pining for the days when nobody knew who the best team was. Wasn't that great? I'm like, how did you live? How did people live? It's like, I don't know. Well, Bear Bryant and Woody Hayes, they're not going to play each other, but they're both great. That's good enough for me. I can't believe people lived in that world. It's like when you watch a movie from the 40s and there are jokes in it. And it's like, I always think, were people dumber back then that they thought this was funny? Was the world just in a place where it's like that's what a joke was? That's what I think when I think about college football in the old days. So I want a champion. And I think there is room to maintain some other stuff. But I do think in the end, I think the worst thing might be half measures. Like when we talk about like, oh, well, what if the SEC just added, or why doesn't the Big Ten add USC? It's like, what are we doing? Like, that's not either have conferences. Now, if there was actual leadership and like somebody at the NCAA could say, you know what? Let's do what makes sense. Let's do 4 16-team conferences. This is your conference. This is your conference. We'll split all the money. It won't be exactly divided, right? It'll be half revenue sharing and half the more you make, the more you get or whatever. But let's not overdo it because everybody's chasing money because there's no regulation. This is like the people who want like no regulation in the world. It's like, good luck. This is everybody out for themselves, stabbing people in the back. You can't trust anybody. This is it. So if you like, maybe you like this. This is great. Texas can do whatever it wants to do. You have a little agreement, and then you sneak out the back door, and you say the other 8 people, I'm sorry, your house is on fire. There's a way to do this, but I think a half measure might be implosion. Yeah. Like if the next 20 years is like, well, and that's why Boston College is in the same conference with Arizona State, and it's like for a TV deal, it's like, what are you talking about? We just need to go all the way then.
Right.
I think if they go all the way, then I think it can be better because I think there's a way to maintain rivalries, share money, but give more money to the big guys, create more great games, have fewer meaningless games during the course of a regular season, get everybody excited, determine a real champion, still have a world where for some teams, just making a playoff is great. I think there's a way to get to that, but I think it might take some leadership and some people at some point doing something other than I want to do what I want to do, and I don't care what happens to anybody else, which is where college sports is, and frankly, the world is right now.
Yeah, well, and one last thing, to kind of close out on this, right? So for people who may know, I'm a Baylor grad, right? And so I'm getting a lot of texts from obviously very concerned people who are kind of in my orbit, right? Baylor, TCU, Texas Tech people. And, a lot of Baylor people are pointing to, man, but like we've, over the last decade in football and every other sport, we've been head and shoulders above where Texas has been, right? We played in the Big 12 title game back in 2019. We won Big 12 titles, all that sort of stuff. We played in New Year's Six Bowls. And the worst part of my job is telling them that doesn't matter. Nobody cares that you were good at football, that you won a basketball national title. That's the worst part of this. And like you mentioned, you kind of alluded to it, right? In the NFL, the way that they try to prop all those teams up so that you have 32 strong franchises is you have revenue sharing, right? The Buffalo Bills get money from the New England Patriots, from the Pittsburgh Steelers, from the Dallas Cowboys. Obviously, that's not a world that I anticipate happening in college football. And so I almost wonder if anything is just always going to be some level of half measure because there's sort of a concerted effort to devalue a whole lot of the product.
But they do share, like in your conference, you share, right? Alabama shares with Kentucky. Ohio State shares with Purdue. Like they do share that. And part of the deal with the Big 12 is Texas and Oklahoma got tired of sharing with Kansas and with Iowa State. And it doesn't matter, like you said, the idea that it doesn't matter how good you are on the field if you don't have a big enough alumni base and you're not as attractive as a television property, that's what matters. That is very frustrating. And again, if there was any kind of anybody in charge to say, let's do this in a way that will be better for everybody, but it'll be equitable, that's a dream though, because the NCAA has given up. Maybe the best part of all this, I hope the NCAA implodes. The NCAA should send out faxes about here's your bracket for your championship. Swing by and pick up a key to the gym. That's what the NCAA should do. There is no reason, and you don't need 400 employees and a bunch of people making $500,000 a year to do that. Where is the key to the gym? That's what the NCAA does. They're the guy, they've got that big keychain like on a block of wood. And it's like, oh, what are you here for? It's like, oh, we're here for the lacrosse championships. Oh, let me see what key that is. That is what Mark Emmert is good for. There is nothing else he needs to do.
Yeah. Please promise me you will never let me put out a statement basically saying that the organization I work for should not exist.
We'll see how the podcast goes. I have a statement on behalf of the College Football Playoff Show. I'm not sure we should be doing this. By the way, you do have a $40 million grant of rights for this podcast, though. You can't leave for 10 years or you have to pay me $40 million. But last thing, craziest thing that you've ever done or that has happened to you at a sporting event of any kind, whether it was Pee Wee football or Little League or middle school or high school or as a journalist or as a fan.
You go first. I need some idea of what you're asking.
So this is just, again, it's old man story time. We should just change it to this. It's like, oh, let's get to know each other. It's like, oh, great, another Doug story. So when I was a baseball writer in the 90s, the late 90s, the Milwaukee Brewers have a sausage race where, like, a lot of the I think the Pirates have a pierogi race and the Washington Nationals have a president race. Lots of places have the races now. So I went down, I was covering the Philadelphia Phillies, and I went down to like write a story about like, how do you do the race? Like, who is it? Whatever. And they were like, I don't know, you want to do it? And I was like, do I want to do it? So I got to run in the sausage race at a Milwaukee Brewers game. And the broadcast, the TV announcers for the Phillies were informed, and then another writer ran with me that two of the beat writers for the team were running in the sausage race. And Terry Francona was the manager of the Phillies at that time, and he threw a cup of water on me as I was running past. And the thing that I learned is they rig it. So they want to make sure the worst thing that can happen in the sausage race is that it's an unclear winner, because they know people are betting. So it was like it had to be decided ahead of time who was going to win. And even though it was my idea, my friend who was a writer who kind of weaseled his way in to run it with me, he was like, I'll win. And I was like, all right, I guess you'll win. And so he like got to the tape and he leaned at the tape like he was in the Olympic 100 meters, and his pierogi almost slid off his body. No, his sausage almost slid off his body, because it was like, don't lean, dude. You're not Usain Bolt. Don't lean in the sausage costume. But I got to finish second as the Italian sausage. And that is journalism.
Well, one that just came to mind for me. So back in 2016, Tennessee and Virginia Tech, right? They played this football game at Bristol Motor Speedway, right? And so as part of that, they, for marketing or whatever, they were like, come on out and write a story basically about how we're turning this NASCAR track into a football field. So I got to go, I'd never really been to a NASCAR race before. And so I got to go to the night race over at Bristol Motor Speedway and watch it from like the infield, from like up in like that whole deal. So that was,
nice.
Yeah.
For a football guy.
For a football guy. Yeah. So it was a lot of fun, got to do a lot of tours of the track and stuff. And listen, again, I didn't grow up with NASCAR, but I can appreciate Bristol Motor Speedway, man. That's a special place.
I've done some NASCAR, and it's like there is nothing that can make you feel stupider than like being around NASCAR and trying to talk NASCAR with people who really are experts on NASCAR and be like, yeah, man, I drive like a Chevy Cruze. I think it has 4 horsepower. I don't even know what that means. All right. But everybody should do it. It's a great like cultural experience. Like of the things you should do, it's like go to a NASCAR race and see what that's all about. Like it is intense, man. And it's loud. So that is the press conference. It went long. Sometimes press conferences go long when there's a lot of questions. Stuff is on fire. We think by next week, maybe there'll be a little less on fire. So we'll get back to a shorter version of the press conference. We appreciate you guys joining us. Make sure you catch the pod where we're going to talk about Iowa State. We're going to talk about Bama, Clemson, Ohio State, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, maybe Iowa State. Who is the best running backs? That's the pod this week. We appreciate you guys being part of it. If you want to go a step further, 817-442-6789. Send a text there, and you can get in and get some text from us. Ask us questions. Vote in the poll. For Shahan Jayaraja, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was the College Football Playoff Show.